Hey, Brad, I hope you're doing well. Welcome into the game in Tuscaloosa, Alabama.
Ryan, how you been? It's been a few weeks, but always stuff to talk about with college football.
Plenty of talk about, man. You guys are giving us a ton of topics there on ESPN.com. Certainly the Football Power Index is something we want to cover. But let me ask you about the question here just for a couple of minutes. When you begin to look at Alabama, what is your number one question going into spring practice 3 weeks from a day about Alabama?
Mine is actually going to be depth on defense, and I think even when it comes to the secondary, the quality of the starters there. I mean, typically this is not an issue with Alabama. We all know how they've reloaded year after year, no matter how many starters they've lost. But this is a rare case where a position group has been almost completely depleted. I mean, there have been many times where Alabama maybe lost all of its defensive line or all of its linebackers, but the guys who were going to become the new starters had all played a lot. They just hadn't technically started. There aren't many guys outside of Deontay Thompson who have played many significant snaps in the secondary, and I think that's a valid question as you go into this season, especially when you consider that there are significant losses up front defensively as well. So it's not like you can mask any deficiencies in the secondary by having a front that's going to get to the quarterback within 2.5 seconds every snap. I think there are major questions. I think how they replace Deron Payne is a big question, because I don't see anyone on the roster who fills that role. I mean, I'm sure there are plenty of good defensive linemen, but in terms of a guy who's just a big body inside who can just push people off the line, just demands double teams. I don't know if they have a guy like that either. So that to me is the big question: is how good are they going to be on defense? Look, I'm not expecting them to become bad defensively by any stretch, but we've always been able to count on Alabama being one of the best defenses in the whole country. Will they still be that? And if they are, I think they'll be right where they have been each of the last 10 years, which is competing for a national championship. The only way I see them, not competing for that is if the defense takes a major step back. I'm not saying I expect it to, but I think there's some legitimate questions that have to be answered on that side.
Brad, let me go and ask you the question. When you look at this much turnover, I know this is Nick Saban. I know that this guy obviously is a legend. He may be the best to ever walk the sidelines. I think he is. I think you think he is. But when does this coaching turnover catch up with even a guy like Nick Saban?
Well, look, I think, and we talked about this back during bowl season, I believe, which is that it's not just that he's having to replace coordinators. It's that when he has former assistants of his who have become head coaches in the same conference, they're all after. Like, he's competing with them now for assistant coaches who are familiar with their scheme, with that philosophy on defense. And so I think that makes it more difficult. Maybe there was a time when he kind of had his pick of the litter. But now, Kirby Smart obviously has a good thing going in Athens, and they're going to be people just as interested in jumping on board there as there would be with Saban and Tuscaloosa. And I'm sure there are people who will, like the challenge of going to Knoxville with Jeremy Pruitt. And so you throw that on top of the people who have always been looking to grab, people who have worked for Saban to just maybe get a little bit of that experience and hope that it can serve them well. And it's just making it more difficult to get the same type of guy who he's been, replacing all these other guys with in the last few years. And so I think that's where the challenge is. Look, it certainly seems that he had a game plan here that he was going to get younger on the coaching staff, but you just wonder, is that lack of experience in some areas something that could hurt when it comes to game week and game prep and all that stuff. So we'll have to wait and see. But up to this point, I've seen no reason to doubt Nick Saban, and so it's gonna take a year where Alabama does not meet expectations before most people around the country are going to assume that he's not going to continue to do what he's been doing.
And Brad, think about this, and if you want to look at it from a positive side here in Tuscaloosa, if there was another coach in college football that was losing both coordinators, 4 or 5 assistant coaches, and I don't even know if we're finished. I've heard this, that. I knew about Carl Dunbar coming, but obviously there's no announcement there. We don't have a official press release. If there's a co-defensive coordinator, a co-offensive coordinator, we don't have anything. Nick Saban told us that he would give us a release when he wanted us to have a release. That was his words.
Yep.
And so, I keep waiting for this release. So, I feel like unofficially, every time I quote the offensive coordinator, well, we think we know who it is. But if there was another coach out there that we're going through all this and losing everything that they've lost, you guys probably wouldn't have them at number 2 in the football power index. But I guess it's like we all believe in Nick Saban.
Yeah. Now, look, just for clarification, for FPI, the only coach we're looking at is the head coach. Now, there is a certain point where coordinators are going to matter. And I think when you lose the number of assistant coaches that Alabama has lost, including both coordinators, I think more often than not, that would be detrimental to the team's success the following season. You would expect some sort of drop-off. And look, as great as Kirby Smart has started at Georgia, there are a lot of similarities, between the way he started and the way Saban started at Alabama, with the great success on the field in year 2. Already has that ball rolling with his second and third recruiting classes ranking very high. But the only way that you're going to be able to say that, okay, Georgia is Alabama 2.0 is not only if Kirby Smart goes on to start winning, national titles, but he's got to show that he can survive the things that Saban has survived with not only, losing coordinators on both sides of the ball and having to replace those guys, but Kirby hasn't been doing this long enough to have really had to replace a quarterback yet. And one thing with Saban is that it was never predicated on the QB. And Kirby had a very good QB last year. And look, based on the recruiting, you would think that if it's not Jake Fromm, then it'll be the kids at Fields that they signed. And so you would think they're in good shape. But that's another test. And in other words, in order for the program to sustain success, you've got to be able to overcome losses, whether that's at quarterback or whether that's on the coaching staff, and not have a drop-off. And Saban he's one of the few in college football history who has ever shown an ability to do that over an extended period of time. And so I think that's really what separates him from everyone else.
I just wonder if that went into Nick Saban. I'm not asking you to guess what went into Nick Saban's mind, because I guess he would only know that. But I just wonder if that's what went into him selecting young coaches that are working their way up the list, where he doesn't have to go through this in 2018.
Well, that's possible, where if it's going to take a few years of, showing something for other schools to be interested in the guys who he's just put onto his staff, that could be part of it. It also could be that he's maybe focusing more on recruiting, not that the on-the-field coaching doesn't matter, because we all know it's very important. But look, I think it probably shook Alabama fans more than it did the Saban and the coaching staff, what happened in this last recruiting cycle. It's not like it wasn't a good class, but it just wasn't what everybody had come to expect. And I think it's a little bit of a new world now, though, on the recruiting front. Look, in the same way that you saw Saban make an adjustment on defense when he was having trouble defending these spread offenses, and he got smaller at linebacker, smaller and faster in order to keep up with those. The same way he was willing to adapt by going to a dual threat quarterback and running up tempo himself offensively. He did that to be able to keep an edge and not fall behind. I think the realization that what Georgia is doing on the recruiting front is not going to go away might have fed into this, the decision to get younger guys who are going to be better recruiters. Because look at this signing class. Unless I missed someone, there was not a player from Georgia that was in this most recent signing class. I don't believe there was one from Mississippi either. And I think there was only one from Alabama, one from Tennessee, and none from the Florida Panhandle. So it's basically like within a 250-mile radius of campus, I think they signed 2 players. And that's not a model for success. As well as they recruit nationally, at some point, in order to sustain it, you've got to be able to recruit in your backyard. You might be able to get away with it for 1 year, but I think Saban realizes that, and that it's not going to be as easy to go into these bordering states and get guys as it used to. And so I think that's probably part of what he's doing. He's trying to stay ahead of the game and adjust to something that could be a problem before it becomes a problem.
Brad, could you take a couple of seconds here and explain to us, because we want to work our way to the FPI, the Football Power Index on ESPN.com. Give us in layman's terms what exactly that is. I know I've asked you this before, but just in case people don't understand this, and then we'll work our way to the rankings.
Yeah, so FPI is basically a set of power rankings, which one way of looking at it is it's ordering the teams by who's the best. Okay, this is it. Head-to-head does not go into FPI explicitly. And one great example of this is that at the end of the 2016 season, Alabama, even though they lost the national championship game to Clemson, Alabama was still ranked number 1 at the end of the season by FPI, which was basically a way of saying that Alabama was the best team in the country over the entirety of the season, and that FPI believed that if those teams played again, that Alabama should be favored. And if you take a step back and you look at it, they and Clemson both finished that season at 14-1. Clemson had 8 games that were decided by 1 possession. Alabama had 2. And so just, looking at it from a standpoint of dominance, if you just assume a very similar strength of schedule, Alabama was much more convincing in the way that it won games that season, which would lead you to believe Alabama was the better team. Now, that's overly simplifying it. But the point is it's not about who has the better record, and it's not even about who won head-to-head. It's about looking at all the games and how good were you over the course of all those games. Now, when we're in preseason FPI, it's how good are you expected to be. And so, right now, we're looking at Clemson at number 1, Alabama at number 2. The preseason inputs for FPI. There's a lot of the stuff that you and everyone else will talk about for the next few months as you try to break down different teams. You look at, okay, how good were they last year? And FPI looks at how good a team has been over the last 4 years, with more emphasis on last year than any of the other seasons, more emphasis on 2 years ago than 4 years ago. And then it looks at how many players do you have coming back from last year's team, and is the quarterback one of them? Because it matters a little bit more with that position than it does with the others. Is the head coach back? And then it looks at 4-year recruiting rankings, and that's what goes into it. So if you look at Alabama and Clemson side by side, the only real difference between those teams in those categories going into this current season is that Clemson has 5 more returning starters than Alabama, and that's why. I mean, if you want to get right down to it, that's why Clemson's number 1. And Alabama's number 2. And I know there are a lot of people who would say, well, look at what Alabama's done. They've shown that it doesn't matter. And I would say, yes, they have. And that makes Alabama an outlier. The history tells us, or at least recent history, as we've done this for a little bit more than 10 years, tells us that when you lose half of your starters, the vast majority of the time, you're not going to be as good as you were the year before. Somehow, Alabama has defied the odds on that and just loses half of its starters every single year and continues to be a national title contender, if not ultimately the national champion. But that's not normal. And a model like this for FPI is not built on trying to identify the exceptions to the rule and write stuff in for those. We're trying to be accurate about the greatest number of teams we possibly can. And in order to do that, we have to go with what are the proven indicators, and returning starters is one of those. And look, Alabama, I think we've just pretty much accepted they're probably going to be better than FPI expects them to be every year, because for whatever reason, losing all those guys just doesn't affect them as much as it does any normal team.
I appreciate you doing that, giving a little prediction model lesson right here on the game.
Yeah.
And listen, Brad, you wouldn't believe the people. I've got like 4 text messages in 2 minutes. Well, that's baloney. Clemson's number 1, Alabama's number 2. You know these Alabama fans, Brad. You went to the University of Alabama. They're not happy with number 2, man. They're in a meltdown because the ESPN has projected them to be at number 2 rather than number 1.
Hey, let me throw this out to you for anyone who's thinking there's some sort of bias built into this thing that ESPN's got an agenda against Alabama or the SEC or whatever.
You guys don't. You guys don't.
No, I mean I know that's shocking to people, but we don't. In fact, of the 5 or 6 people who've been heavily involved in the development of FPI since its infancy, only one of them attended a Power 5 school, and he went to UCLA. And UCLA, with Chip Kelly, by the way, as its new head coach, is ranked 49th. So if there was a bias in this thing, that's where it would show up. So based on UCLA's ranking, I can assure you that there's not anything seeping into it. Look, it's common sense. If it were not Alabama, or if Alabama had not done what it's done over the last 10 years, and you looked at 2 teams that have both been really good for the last 4 years, but one of them has 5 more starters coming back than the other one does, then most people, if you label them Team A and Team B, people would say, oh, we're going with Team A with the 5 more returning starters. And it's that simple. But I'll also say this. FPI adjusts pretty quickly as these games start being played. And if Alabama goes at and blows out the first 2 or 3 opponents, and Clemson has 1 or 2 of those games where they don't win by as much as they're expected to, it's not going to take much to get Alabama back to number 1. I mean, Alabama has finished number 1 in FPI 3 seasons in a row, even though they were only the national champion 2 of those 3 seasons. So it's not like FPI has a problem with Bama once they start playing games, because what they do on the field kind of speaks for itself.
What was the biggest surprise to you in the projection model there as far as looking at the top 10? Was there anything that grabbed you?
Well, Notre Dame jumped out at me as a little higher than I expected at number 5. I really don't see them as a top 10 team myself. But the biggest one is Michigan State. Michigan State's sitting there at number 10. And I only know this because I pay much more attention to FPI than most people. Michigan State, even when they're good and even when they're highly ranked nationally, does not impress FPI. I mean, like, ever. When Michigan State made the playoff a couple of years ago and met Alabama in that semifinal, they were ranked in the 30s in FPI. FPI just does not buy into Michigan State, and only part of that is because their recruiting rankings aren't good. It's also because on the field, usually when they win, they don't win pretty. And Michigan State's at number 10, which that to me was shocking to see them that high, because I think it's been like 4 years since they got into the top 10 of FPI. And like I said, that includes a season where they made the playoff that they never even got close to that high. So that is unusual. And you look at the Big Ten, and they have 5 teams in the top 12. And I know a lot of people roll their eyes at that, and that might not even be close to reality once we start playing games. But here's something that people will get a kick out of, is that the next version of FPI, which will come out, I believe, in April, we start to incorporate all the schedules, and we start to make projections. How many games is this team going to win? Who's the favorite to win this division, this conference, et cetera? Michigan, with our good friend Jim Harbaugh at head coach, number 11, coming off of a pretty bleak 8-5 season last year. That doesn't tell the story for Michigan. I don't think they're going to be as happy, the Michigan fans, when they get to the second version of FPI, because they have 5 opponents that are ranked in the top 12. 3 of those are on the road, which means that in what should be a pretty big year for Harbaugh, I think FPI is going to project them to be either 9-3 or 8-4. So that's a really tough draw schedule-wise for Michigan, even if they are a top 10-ish caliber team. So much of it has to do with who you have to play, and their schedule is brutal from that standpoint.
All right, final question. When you were penciling in the quarterback, did you pencil in Tua or Jalen when you put in the FP?
Yeah,
I just wanted
that's a fair question,
okay.
And I would say that within FPI's model, it doesn't matter.
Okay.
The way that it treats it is that if you have a returning starter at quarterback, it assumes that you will be that good offensively, basically what you were the year before, at least at quarterback. And if someone beats out, and most of the time this happens, it's with a transfer. Like you have a transfer quarterback come in, he beats out the starter. Then the assumption is that you're going to be at least as good. So as long as the starter's back, whether he ends up being the starter come September, then it's not going to change anything. This is a very rare situation though, where the little bit of activity, the little bit of playing time that you got from the backup was actually more effective than what you got from the starter. And so it's possible that the offense could be better. But look, if Tua does win the job and he starts the first few games, and Alabama's offense, which is projected by FPI to be, I believe, number 4. I mean, so look, it's not like FPI doesn't think Alabama's offense is going to be good with Hurts. I mean, they're projected at 4th best in the country. So they would have to really light it up with a different quarterback in order to go higher than that. And I guess my point is, it doesn't matter who the quarterback is. Once they start playing games, if the offense ends up being better than expected, it will adjust, upwardly for that. And so that's why, as counterintuitive as it seems, the name of the quarterback is not as important to FPI as it might seem like it should be.